With American troops facing fire abroad and the homeland security apparatus shuttered here at home, the Senate is advancing a sweeping and deeply polarized overhaul of how Americans register to vote. Welcome to Floor Notes Extended. I'm Paige.
And I'm Reed. And Paige, talk about a classic Senate split screen. You have massive, immediate national security concerns happening in real time. But if you tuned into C-SPAN this week, the debate was entirely focused on election mechanics.
Exactly. Which, honestly, is exactly why we do the extended version of the show. On the daily feed, we might just give you the quick headline that Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat of New York, filed cloture on a voting bill. And then we move on to the next item.
Right. We'd give you the 60-second summary, but today we actually have the time to unpack this one. We can look at how this overhaul is built, why it's moving right now instead of the Homeland Security funding, and what the members themselves are actually saying on the record.
And there is a lot on the record to cover. We are going to take some detours today,
Because the context really matters here. This isn't just a minor tweak to poll hours or campaign disclosure forms. We're looking at a fundamental shift.
It's huge. We are talking about what could be the largest change to state-level election administration in a generation. And as we'll hear today, the debate really highlights two completely different philosophies on the role of the federal government in local voting booths.
We'll get into the specific mandates, the procedural hurdles, and how that Homeland Security shutdown is hanging over the chamber as background noise. But let's start with the centerpiece of the debate itself. Reed, take us into the federalization of election rules. So, to set the stage for this, we need to look at what just happened on the floor. The Senate held a procedural vote on S. 1383, which is the legislative vehicle for the SAVE Act. That stands for the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act.
Right, and that motion to proceed passed by a razor-thin margin of 51 to 48. Senate Majority Leader John Thune, Republican of South Dakota, initiated the process, and it fell almost entirely along party lines, with Senator Thom Tillis, Republican of North Carolina, noted as absent. That narrow vote officially opened the door to the full debate we are seeing right now.
And the debate is incredibly intense. To understand why, we have to look at the two main pillars of the SAVE Act. First, it requires documentary proof of United States citizenship to register to vote in federal elections. Second, it requires a photo ID to actually cast that ballot.
Republicans are framing this as the most basic, fundamental common sense. They are pointing to public polling that consistently shows upwards of 80% of Americans support voter ID laws. Senator Roger Marshall, Republican of Kansas, asked his colleagues why voting is the only place we don't ask for basic proof of eligibility.
Senator Ted Cruz, Republican of Texas, actually gave a fairly extensive list on the floor of everyday activities that require an ID. He pointed out that you need a photo ID to buy alcohol, to get on an airplane, to check into a hotel, and, this was his personal favorite, he noted you need 2 forms of ID to shovel snow in New York City.
I loved that detail, but it gets to their core argument. Republicans see the SAVE Act as a necessary mechanism to ensure confidence in the electoral system. They argue that if you have millions of undocumented immigrants in the country, you need strict federal verification to ensure that only citizens are voting. It's a trust but verify philosophy.
But Democrats are arguing that this legislation goes far beyond simply flashing a driver's license at a polling place, and they are using very strong language to describe it. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat of New York, drew a hard line during his floor speech. I'm going to quote directly from the Congressional Record here. He said, "The SAVE Act is not a voter ID bill. It is, in every sense, a voter suppression bill."
And that is exactly why we do the extended format, Paige. Because to understand why Senator Schumer is calling it a suppression bill, you have to look past the top-line talking points and get into the actual mechanics of what the bill requires. The friction really centers around that documentary proof of citizenship provision.
Exactly. Senator Alex Padilla, Democrat of California, pointed out on the floor that the SAVE Act does not allow Americans to use standard driver's licenses to register to vote. You have to provide a passport or a birth certificate.
Right. And as Senator Padilla and others noted, roughly half of all Americans do not have a passport. And getting one isn't just a matter of running down to the post office on your lunch break. It currently costs over $160 and takes several weeks to process.
Which brings us to a specific demographic that Democrats argue will be disproportionately burdened by this: married women. Senator Patty Murray, Democrat of Washington, and Senator Amy Klobuchar, Democrat of Minnesota, both highlighted that if you changed your last name when you got married, your current ID likely does not match the name on your original birth certificate.
So, imagine the logistics of that under the SAVE Act. You couldn't just register online or send in a mail-in card. You would have to go in person to an election office, bring your birth certificate, bring your marriage license, and sign an affidavit just to prove you are the same person.
Senator Schumer argued this effectively forces in-person registration, which he noted is a method currently utilized by only about 5% of the American electorate today. He warned it would essentially end online voter registration and the motor voter system.
I want to pause on the mechanics for a second, because there is another layer to this bill that we really need to unpack. It involves data sharing, and it's a huge part of the Democratic pushback.
You're talking about the Department of Homeland Security provision.
Yes, the SAVE Act would require states to run their voter rolls through a Department of Homeland Security database to check for non-citizens. Now, Republicans argue this is a necessary cross-check, but Democrats argue the DHS data was never built for local election administration.
They're warning it could trigger algorithms that falsely flag naturalized citizens or people with those name changes we just talked about, which would lead to eligible voters being mistakenly purged from the rolls. Senator Schumer actually referred to this on the floor as a, quote, screening algorithm designed by Elon Musk's Doge Squad.
So you really see the two different worldviews here. Republicans look at the system and see a vulnerability that requires strict, federalized verification. Democrats look at that exact same verification method and argue it is so strict and so rigid that it will inevitably disenfranchise millions of eligible legal voters.
But Reed, the SAVE Act isn't the only piece of the election puzzle moving right now. If we are talking about who counts in American democracy, we have to talk about the census.
We absolutely do. And this is the detour we promised. While the debate over the SAVE Act has been dominating the headlines, Senator John Kennedy, Republican of Louisiana, submitted an amendment to this exact same legislative vehicle.
This is Amendment 4452. I have the text right here, and I'm going to read the title directly from the record because it tells you exactly what it intends to do. Quote, exclusion of individuals not lawfully present in the United States from number of persons used to determine apportionment of representatives and number of electoral votes.
Okay, so let's break down why that is such a massive deal. The 14th Amendment of the Constitution says that seats in the House of Representatives, and by extension, the Electoral College votes, are apportioned based on the whole number of persons in each state. Historically, for over 2 centuries, that has meant counting everyone living there, regardless of their immigration status.
Senator Kennedy's amendment would change that formula, starting with the 2030 census. It would legally mandate that undocumented immigrants are excluded from that specific count.
And the political math on that is staggering. If you remove an estimated 11 to 12 million undocumented residents from the apportionment data, you are fundamentally redistributing political power in Washington. States with high immigrant populations, like California or New York, could lose multiple House seats, while states with smaller immigrant populations would gain proportional power.
It's really a two-pronged approach we're watching unfold. You have the SAVE Act, aiming to change the mechanical rules of who can cast a ballot in the 2026 midterms. And you have this census amendment, aiming to change the constitutional distribution of representation for 2030.
Which explains why The rhetoric on the floor is at such an elevated pitch. This isn't a minor policy disagreement over early voting hours. It is a battle over the structural foundation of the electorate itself.
Republicans, like Senator Eric Schmidt of Missouri, argue this is about defending the basic concept of a republic. He stated on the floor that the vote is a central privilege of political membership, not a global entitlement, and that citizenship has to mean something.
While Democrats argue this entire legislative package is a coordinated power grab, Senator Schumer and several others pointed to comments allegedly made by Donald Trump, suggesting that passing the SAVE Act would guarantee the midterms for Republicans. Democrats are framing this as a cynical attempt to rewrite the rules right before a tough election cycle.
It's the classic tension of election law debates, just amplified to the highest possible volume. You have Republicans stating they want to make it easier to vote and harder to cheat, and you have Democrats stating the GOP is trying to make it harder to vote and easier to steal an election.
And sitting right in the middle of all this procedural maneuvering and this intense philosophical debate over voting rights is a massive, unresolved appropriations crisis.
Which brings us to the elephant in the room. You can't talk about the Senate's focus on the SAVE Act without talking about what the Senate isn't funding right now. We have to pivot to the broader context hanging over this entire debate: national security gridlock, a hot war, and a cold shutdown. Which brings us to the elephant in the room. You can't talk about the Senate's focus on the SAVE Act without talking about what the Senate isn't funding right now. We have to pivot to the broader context hanging over this entire debate: national security gridlock, a hot war, and a cold shutdown.
Right. Because sitting directly adjacent to this procedural fight over voting rights, you have the Department of Homeland Security running on fumes. As of mid-March 2026, DHS has been shut down for 32 days.
32 days. For context, we are looking at over 100,000 federal employees going without paychecks. And we are not just talking about administrative office staff. We are talking about the Transportation Security Administration, Customs and Border Protection, the Coast Guard, and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency.
And the operational cracks are becoming incredibly visible. We are seeing major staffing shortages. According to floor speeches from this week, TSA callouts are hitting 50% at some airports. Over 300 TSA officers have reportedly resigned just since this specific shutdown began. And this isn't just about longer lines at airport security, though that is obviously a massive disruption for spring break travel. We are looking at paused programs like Global Entry, canceled training for emergency management personnel at FEMA, and disruptions to Coast Guard deployments in international hotspots.
Which brings us to Senator John Thune, a Republican from South Dakota. He took to the floor this week to deliver a blistering critique of the Democratic caucus, essentially blaming them for the entire impasse.
What was his core argument?
He argued that Republicans have already passed a DHS funding bill out of the House, and that Senate Democrats are repeatedly blocking procedural efforts to move forward with it. The crux of the disagreement is over immigration enforcement.
Right. Democrats have been pushing for specific reforms. They want restrictions on immigration and customs enforcement operations at sensitive locations like schools. They want to require judicial warrants for home entries, and they want mandated funding for body cameras and de-escalation training.
Exactly. Thune says the Republican bill already includes some of those elements, like body camera funding, and that the floor is open for amendments. But he accuses Democrats of bad faith negotiations, noting it took them 18 days to respond to the White House's latest offer. I want to read a bit of what Senator Thune said on the floor. He stated, "For Democrats, a government shutdown is just fine as long as it seems to be working for them politically, no matter whether it is hurting hard-working Americans."
He also pushed back hard on the Democratic strategy of piecemeal funding, didn't he?
Yes. Democratic leadership proposed funding the non-controversial DHS agencies, like TSA and the Coast Guard, while leaving ICE and Customs and Border Protection unfunded until a broader agreement is reached. Thune attacked that idea, asking, when did defunding law enforcement become a mainstream position in this country?
And on the other side, Democrats, including Majority Leader Chuck Schumer of New York and Senator Brian Schatz, a Democrat from Hawaii, argue that Republicans are the ones refusing substantive talks. They view their piecemeal funding offers as a moderate compromise to get federal employees paid, and accuse Republicans of holding those critical agencies hostage over border policy.
What makes this particular shutdown so fraught is the broader threat environment. Senator Thune specifically referenced recent domestic incidents, including individuals with alleged ties to ISIS and Hezbollah, as well as cyber attacks linked to Iran, to argue that playing politics with DHS funding right now is incredibly dangerous.
Which is the perfect pivot to the other half of this dynamic. Because while the domestic security apparatus is paralyzed over funding fights, the United States is currently engaged in an active, escalating military conflict overseas.
The situation with Iran.
Yes, we are in week 3 of a conflict that the administration initially projected would last only a matter of days.
And the human cost is mounting. According to the Congressional Record, as of mid-March, 13 American service members have been killed, and around 200 have been injured.
The geopolitical fallout is massive, too. The Strait of Hormuz is effectively closed, global oil prices are spiking, and the Iranian regime hasn't collapsed. In fact, reports suggest their stance has hardened.
This is where the Senate's oversight role collides with the executive branch's military actions. Senate Democrats are demanding public, sworn testimony from the president's cabinet regarding this operation.
They don't just want a classified briefing in a secure room. They want the public to hear the justification.
No, they want this on camera, under oath. Specifically, they are demanding to hear from Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. They want answers on the overarching objective, whether ground troops will be deployed, and what the exact exit strategy is.
And they're threatening to use war powers resolutions to force the issue. For people who might not follow the procedural quirks of the Senate, a war powers resolution is one of the few tools the minority party has to force the majority's hand. It's a privileged resolution, which means it can bypass the usual committee blockades and force the Senate leadership to actually hold a floor vote.
I want to pull a quote from a Democratic floor speech that really captures the temperature in the chamber regarding the administration's handling of the conflict. The speaker said, "If you break it, you buy it. Well, Donald Trump, you broke it badly, and now you are trying to get out of paying the price." They went on to demand accountability, stating, "We need to hear from Secretary Rubio, Secretary Hegseth, and others under oath, and answer tough questions."
The criticism centers around what Democrats describe as strategic miscalculations. They've pointed to the administration's reported shock at retaliatory Iranian strikes against U.S. assets in places like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, and Kuwait, arguing it shows a fundamental lack of preparedness.
But there is one more layer to this foreign policy puzzle that I want to highlight, and it involves an amendment submitted by Senator Ruben Gallego, a Democrat from Arizona.
The Russian Oil Sanctions Amendment. This is a really interesting detour.
It is. Senator Gallego submitted an amendment to a completely separate Veterans Advisory Committee bill. It was ordered to lie on the table, which means it isn't an active item for a floor debate right now, but rather a formal record of intent. It's essentially a formal condemnation of a decision made by the Trump administration on March 5th.
Right in the middle of this escalating Iran conflict.
Exactly. The administration authorized a 30-day window for oil transactions between India and the Russian Federation, effectively easing sanctions on Russian oil during a period of very high global oil prices.
And the spike in oil prices is directly related to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz because of the conflict with Iran.
Precisely. Gallego's amendment points out a deeply uncomfortable alleged dynamic. According to reports cited in his amendment, the Russian Federation is actively helping Iran target United States personnel and assets across the region.
So the argument is that the U.S. is easing sanctions, allowing Russia to financially benefit from a spike in oil prices caused by a conflict where Russia is allegedly assisting the opposing side against American troops.
Let me read the exact wording from Gallego's amendment. In issuing that license during a spike in oil prices, the Trump administration is helping Russia and its oil trading intermediaries benefit financially, while Russia targets our service members.
It really paints a picture of a fractured, highly complex geopolitical landscape. You have a domestic security apparatus struggling to pay its airport screeners, an active hot war in the Middle East with rising American casualties, and fierce Senate debates over everything from body cameras for border agents to global oil sanctions.
And all of these threads, the stalled domestic funding, the military escalation, the foreign policy maneuvers, are fundamentally arguments about how the executive branch chooses to operate when Congress is gridlocked.
Right. When the legislative branch is paralyzed by partisanship, the executive branch inevitably steps into the vacuum to act. But that raises an entirely new set of constitutional and practical questions about accountability.
Up next, the price of executive power.
Let's look at how that dynamic plays out when executive action intersects directly with federal funds. We are looking at a highly unusual situation involving the Department of Justice and the Federal Tort Claims Act.
Right, the FTCA. For anyone who hasn't spent time dealing with federal claims, this is the statute that allows private citizens to sue the United States in federal court for certain torts committed by people acting on behalf of the government.
In practice, it's usually for mundane things. A postal truck backs into your fence, or you slip and fall at a VA hospital. You file an administrative claim, and as the government is liable, they pay you out of something called the judgment fund.
But right now, the FTCA is at the center of a major congressional debate over a reported $230 million claim by President Trump.
Exactly. The claim stems from administrative complaints the president filed as a private citizen, seeking damages related to the FBI and special counsel investigations into his conduct prior to this current term. And because he is now the chief executive overseeing the very department reviewing those claims, Congress is testing the limits of its oversight power to intervene.
Which brings us to March 17, 2026. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat of New York, introduced Senate Bill 4124. It's a binding legislative measure specifically designed to restrict the Justice Department from using federal funds to provide personal payments to a sitting president.
It essentially says, you cannot use the judgment fund to pay yourself. But getting a binding piece of legislation like that through a divided Congress is a steep climb. So we are also seeing parallel efforts using different legislative tools.
Like Senate Amendment 4454, introduced by Senator Jackie Rosen, Democrat of Nevada. This is a sense of Congress resolution. It doesn't have the force of law, but it formally places the Senate's position on the record. And the language is pointed. The amendment states that it, quote, condemns in the strongest possible terms the calls by President Donald Trump for the Department of Justice to pay him $230 million.
What really stands out in Rosen's amendment is the timeline she constructs regarding DOJ personnel. This is the benefit of a deeper dive. Most headlines just focus on the dollar amount, but the amendment explicitly notes that between January and July 2025, the Justice Department removed or fired several senior career ethics officials,
including the Associate Deputy Attorney General, the Director of the Office of Professional Responsibility, and the Director of the Departmental Ethics Office.
Right. The argument being made in the Senate is that those personnel changes cleared the way for a compromised review of the president's financial claim. It's fundamentally a debate about the domestic emoluments clause and whether the DOJ can act independently when the president is both the claimant and the boss.
And that question of Justice Department independence is spilling over into the House of Representatives as well, specifically focusing on the new head of the department,
Attorney General Pam Bondi.
Correct. Also on March 17th, Representative Summer Lee, Democrat of Pennsylvania, introduced House Resolution 1119. It is a formal resolution impeaching the Attorney General of the United States.
Impeaching a cabinet official is historically rare. For a long time, the only precedent was Secretary of War William Belknap in 1876. Then we saw it recently with Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. Now, we're seeing an impeachment resolution introduced against an attorney general just months into her tenure.
The text was referred to the Judiciary Committee, and it highlights how quickly the tools of ultimate constitutional accountability are being deployed in this session. But while the House looks at the Attorney General, the Senate is aggressively scrutinizing another unique executive power: presidential pardons.
And specifically, the December 1st, 2025 pardon of Juan Orlando Hernandez.
Hernandez is the former president of Honduras. He was convicted of drug trafficking and related crimes in federal court and sentenced to 45 years in prison. His pardon by President Trump was highly controversial, and it has triggered a massive oversight push.
Because the pardon power is nearly absolute, Congress can't overturn a pardon, but what they can do is demand to see the paperwork.
Which is exactly what Senator Catherine Cortez Masto, Democrat of Nevada, is attempting to do.
And this isn't just a simple request for emails. The amendment asks the Justice Department to formally justify the legal basis of the pardon against the specific evidence that was used to convict him in the first place.
The wording in the record is very specific. It demands, quote, a narrative description of how any evidence exonerating Mr. Hernandez overcomes the weight of the evidence introduced at trial, end quote.
And then it lists that trial evidence item by item. It asks the DOJ to explain away photographs of Hernandez with drug traffickers at the 2010 World Cup, audio recordings of MS-13 gang members discussing payments to him, and phone data placing co-conspirators at the Honduran presidential palace.
It also demands a timeline of the federal investigation and a description of the role played by Emil Bove, who was involved in the original prosecution.
It's a fascinating strategy. If Congress can't stop the executive branch from issuing a pardon or potentially paying out a tort claim, they can try to make the administrative process so transparent that it becomes politically prohibitive.
You have the legislative branch attempting to use every tool at its disposal: the power of the purse with the Schumer bill, the impeachment power with the Lee resolution, and reporting requirements with the Cortez Masto amendment to check the executive branch.
And all of this is happening against a backdrop of severe fiscal deadlines and domestic spending debates, which creates a whole different layer of friction.
Up next, the January 6th financial fallout.
Right. Because for years, the legal process surrounding January 6, 2021 was mostly a one-way street: prosecutions, convictions, and financial penalties flowing from the defendants to the government.
But following the blanket presidential pardons issued on day one of the new administration, that street has effectively reversed direction. And that reversal is creating a highly complex and frankly unprecedented fiscal situation.
This is exactly why we do the extended episodes, because the headline here is usually just Congress fights over January 6th again. But the actual mechanics of what is happening behind the scenes with the federal treasury are fascinating. We're talking about millions of taxpayer dollars potentially changing hands.
Let's lay out the exact legislation. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, a Democrat from Rhode Island, and Alex Padilla, a Democrat from California, have submitted two amendments. They are formally attached to a Veterans Affairs bill, but their target is the United States Treasury and the Department of Justice.
What are they trying to stop, specifically?
Two distinct things. First, they want to stop the government from paying out legal settlements to individuals involved in the Capitol breach. And second, they want to stop the government from refunding the restitution that convicted individuals have already paid.
Okay, let's take these one at a time. The settlements. How does someone who breached the Capitol end up in a position to receive a settlement from the federal government?
It comes down to civil litigation. A number of individuals involved in the events of January 6th have filed lawsuits against the government under the Federal Tort Claims Act, alleging harm suffered during the event or during their subsequent prosecutions. And with the change in administration and the blanket pardons, the Justice Department's posture on these lawsuits has shifted. There are reports of the DOJ processing multi-million-dollar settlements, including a recent $5 million settlement approved for the family of Ashley Babbitt.
So, the legislative branch is watching the executive branch settle these lawsuits using federal funds, and lawmakers are pulling the emergency brake.
Exactly. Amendment 4451 is titled the No Settlements for January 6 Law Enforcement Assaulters Act, and the text is incredibly direct. Quoting from the Congressional Record, "No federal funds may be obligated or expended for any legal settlement to a covered individual if the claims giving rise to such settlement are based on alleged harm suffered by the covered individual."
They are specifically targeting the Judgment Fund. For context, the Judgment Fund is this permanent, indefinite appropriation that the Treasury uses to pay out court judgments and settlements when no other specific agency funds are available. It's essentially the government's master checking account for losing lawsuits.
And White House and Padilla are saying, freeze that account for anyone convicted of assaulting a police officer on January 6th, period.
But then there's the Second Amendment, which gets into the restitution refunds. To play devil's advocate here on the legal mechanics, if you receive a presidential pardon and your conviction is legally vacated because the appeals process wasn't completely exhausted, the standard legal procedure in the federal court system is actually to refund your fines and restitution.
Which is exactly what federal prosecutors have been arguing in court. In fact, a federal judge ordered the government to refund restitution to at least one defendant back in August, for exactly that reason.
Right. We actually have time to unpack this one. So let's look at the numbers. The government has collected roughly $400,000 in restitution from January 6 defendants over the last few years. Meanwhile, the architect of the Capitol estimates the physical damage to the building was around $3 million.
So Padilla and White House introduced Amendment 4450. It explicitly bars the United States Treasury for refunding any court-ordered compensation, including restitution or fines, to anyone prosecuted for involvement in the attack, regardless of whether they were subsequently pardoned.
And they don't just want the money to sit in limbo. They have a specific destination in mind.
They do. Let me read the exact directive from the record. The Secretary of the Treasury shall transfer any amounts described in paragraph 1 to the architect of the Capitol.
That is such a specific structural legislative move. They are taking a debate about executive clemency and legal procedure and turning it into a strict accounting directive. Take the $400,000, do not give it back to the defendants, and hand it directly to the agency that fixes the doors and windows.
It really highlights the tension we were just talking about. The president uses the absolute pardon power. The Justice Department aligns its civil litigation strategy with that new reality. And Congress responds by attempting to hardwire the Treasury Department's ledgers to prevent the money from moving.
It's a fascinating standoff, but it's also just one piece of how these national polarized debates are trickling down into the daily operations of the government. In fact, as we look at the broader appropriations bills being drafted right now, we are seeing this exact dynamic play out across almost every agency.
Which brings us to our next major theme. When you combine the power of the purse with deeply held ideological divides, you end up essentially federalizing the culture wars. Federalizing the culture wars. That is exactly the theme here, Reed, and honestly, this is why we do the extended episodes. Because if you just watch the evening news, you'll hear about the broad strokes of these cultural debates, but you miss the actual mechanical ways Congress is trying to hardwire them into federal law. And the perfect example of this is happening right now on what was supposed to be a completely unrelated bill.
Right. Senate Bill 1383. Originally, this was a straightforward piece of legislation to establish a Veterans Advisory Committee on Equal Access. But in the Senate, any bill can become a legislative vehicle, and right now, it is the vehicle for a highly coordinated amendment blitz spearheaded by Senator Marsha Blackburn, a Republican of Tennessee, and Senator Tommy Tuberville, a Republican of Alabama.
They had submitted a trio of amendments on this bill, Senate Amendments 4421, 4425, and 4457. And together, they represent a sweeping effort to establish nationwide federal bans, strict civil liability, and criminal penalties regarding transgender youth. Let's start with the sports piece, because it sets the definitional groundwork.
Right. That's Amendment 4421, which targets Title IX. Title IX, of course, being the landmark 1972 civil rights law prohibiting sex-based discrimination in education programs receiving federal funding. The Blackburn-Tuberville Amendment stipulates that any recipient of federal funds is violating the law if they permit male-identified individuals to participate in women's or girls' sports. But the real structural change is how they mandate that definition across all federally funded institutions.
Exactly. The text explicitly states that, for these purposes, sex shall be recognized based solely on a person's reproductive biology and genetics at birth. And that strict biological definition carries directly over into the next two amendments, which focus on medical care. This is where we move from federal funding conditions into federal criminal and civil law.
And this brings us to Amendment 4457, titled the Chloe Cole Act, named after a prominent detransitioner who has been advocating against gender-affirming care for minors. Contextually, this is a continuation of a push we saw earlier this year when the Department of Justice actually transmitted a version of this framework to Congress. But what is fascinating here is the sheer scope of the enforcement mechanisms they are proposing.
It is massive. Amendment 4425 amends Title 18 of the U.S. Code to impose up to 10 years in prison and federal fines for anyone who knowingly performs what the bill defines as genital or bodily mutilation or chemical castration on a minor. That statutory definition explicitly includes puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and a highly detailed list of surgical procedures.
And I think this is where we have to pause and look at the jurisdictional strategy, because it is so clever. Historically, the regulation of medical practice has been a state-level issue. We've seen a wave of states passing their own bans on these procedures. But state borders are porous. If a minor and their family travel to a neighboring state where the care is legal, a state-level ban doesn't stop it.
So, to get around that, the authors are relying heavily on the Interstate Commerce Clause. The text specifies if federal jurisdiction is triggered if the defendant or the child traveled in interstate commerce, used any facility of interstate commerce, or, and this is the real dragnet, if any payment was made using a credit card across state lines, or any email was sent regarding the procedure. If the surgical instrument used traveled across state lines, the federal criminal penalty applies.
It is an incredibly expansive reading of federal power. And you can see the tension there, right? You have conservative lawmakers who traditionally championed states' rights and local control, actively designing a framework that uses the Commerce Clause to override state-level medical regulations, imposing a single, nationwide federal standard that supersedes local law.
And they are very specific about what does and does not qualify for an exemption under that standard. The amendment has narrow carve-outs for verifiable disorders of sexual development or traumatic physical injuries, but it explicitly rules out psychological justifications. Let me read directly from the record here. Quote, "For the purposes of subparagraph A, the health of a minor does not include I. Mental, behavioral, or emotional distress, or 2. A mental, behavioral, or emotional disorder."
That is a major legal line in the sand. They are preemptively blocking healthcare providers from using gender dysphoria or the risk of severe depression as a medical necessity defense in court. You cannot argue that the procedure was performed to alleviate mental or emotional distress. Legally, the statute simply erases that as a valid justification.
Which brings us to the civil liability side of this. They are proposing a private right of action that allows individuals or their parents to sue doctors, hospitals, and clinics. And this is not standard malpractice liability. The text establishes strict liability and explicitly states that no liability can be waived. So even if a parent or patient signs a comprehensive consent waiver, the provider is still fully liable.
And since we actually have time to unpack this one, let's look at the timeline, because the statute of limitations they've written is extraordinary. Under standard medical malpractice, a patient usually has a few years to file a claim. Under this amendment, a lawsuit can be brought up to 25 years after the patient turns 18, or 4 years from the time any detransition treatment costs are incurred, whichever date is later.
So a physician who provides this care to a 17-year-old could theoretically face a devastating civil lawsuit, including punitive damages, when that patient is 43 years old. It is designed to make the legal risk of providing this care so astronomically high and so permanent that no hospital's legal or insurance department will allow it to happen, regardless of what state they operate in.
It is a fascinating, multi-front legal strategy. You have the criminal penalties enforced by the Department of Justice, the funding restrictions managed by the Department of Education, and this lifelong civil liability enforced through private lawsuits. But to make any of this stick, you need a federal judiciary that will uphold this expansive interpretation of the Commerce Clause and navigate the inevitable constitutional challenges that will follow.
Which is exactly why the conversation in Congress right now isn't just about passing these laws. It is fundamentally about who gets to interpret them. And that brings us to our final topic today, the push for restructuring the Supreme Court.
It is the ultimate long game. We talk all the time about passing legislation, but if the final stop for any major law is the Supreme Court, then the structure of that court is just as important as the text of the bill itself.
And that's why we're seeing this two-pronged legislative effort from Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, a Democrat from Rhode Island. He has introduced two major amendments to Senate Bill 1383 that would fundamentally redesign how the court operates.
This is exactly why we do the extended format, by the way. Because if you just read the headlines, it sounds like standard political maneuvering. But when you look at the mechanics of these proposals, it is a fascinating attempt at institutional engineering.
Let's start with the first piece, the Supreme Court Biennial Appointments and Term Limits Act. It aims to effectively end lifetime appointments, but without amending the Constitution.
Right, which is the immediate puzzle. The Constitution says justices hold their offices during good behavior, which is universally understood as life tenure. So how do you legislate term limits without a constitutional amendment?
By redefining the job description. The amendment creates a statutory distinction between appellate cases and original jurisdiction cases. Here is the exact quote from the record. Only the 9 most recently appointed justices of the Supreme Court of the United States who are not unavailable due to a temporary absence shall preside over appellate jurisdiction cases.
That is such a clever structural workaround. The vast majority of what the Supreme Court does, the big rulings we all read about, are appellate cases. Original jurisdiction cases, like disputes between 2 states over a water boundary, are incredibly rare.
Under this plan, a president appoints 1 new justice in the first and third year of their term. After 18 years, a justice becomes the 10th or 11th most recently appointed, and they cycle out of the appellate workload. They keep their title and salary, but they essentially move to a senior status.
The stated goal here is to lower the temperature. Right now, a Supreme Court vacancy is an unpredictable, high-stakes event. This bill tries to turn it into a scheduled, regular occurrence. Every presidential term gets 2 picks. It regularizes the process.
But that is only half of the structural redesign. The Second Amendment Senator Whitehouse introduced is the Supreme Court Ethics, Recusal, and Transparency Act, or the SCIRT Act.
And this gets into the oversight debate. For its entire history, the Supreme Court has essentially been a self-policing body. If a justice has a potential conflict of interest, that justice alone decides whether to recuse themselves.
The court did adopt its own voluntary ethics code in late 2023. And just recently, in February 2026, they implemented new automated recusal software to flag conflicts internally. But lawmakers backing this bill argue that internal software isn't a substitute for external enforceable rules.
Which brings us to the mandate in the SCERT Act.
Right. The text says the Supreme Court of the United States shall, after appropriate public notice and opportunity for comment, issue a code of conduct for the justices of the Supreme Court. And, crucially, it doesn't leave enforcement up to the justices. It creates a judicial investigation panel made up of 5 circuit court judges to review complaints.
Just think about that power dynamic. You would have lower court judges reviewing the ethics complaints of the Supreme Court justices above them. It completely flips the traditional judicial hierarchy.
It also forces broad new disclosures. If a party or an amicus brief filer spent substantial money lobbying for a justice's confirmation, or gave them a gift within the last 6 years, that triggers mandatory recusal.
Now, to play devil's advocate, the pushback here is substantial. Opponents argue that allowing a panel of lower court judges to discipline Supreme Court justices violates the separation of powers and the constitutional design of one Supreme Court. And practically speaking, getting these through a divided Congress is a tremendously steep climb.
It is. But taking the time to read these amendments shows us where the conversation is heading. These aren't just messaging bills. They are highly detailed blueprints for an alternative version of the judiciary.
And whether it happens in 2 years, 10 years, or never, it tells us exactly how lawmakers are thinking about the intersection of legislation and the courts.
All right, that is going to do it for this deep dive. Thank you for spending some extra time with us today, and we'll see you on the next episode of Floor Notes Extended.
Wait. Before we let everyone go, we have to talk about the Bureau of Prisons.
Oh, right. Because amidst all the partisan gridlock over borders and budgets this week, the Senate actually found a highly specific target for its oversight.
It turns out nothing gets lawmakers moving quite like a tabloid-ready scandal in federal lockup. This is all following the public outrage over Ghislaine Maxwell's unexpected transfer to a minimum security facility.
Right. So a new amendment just dropped
That seeks to legally mandate that convicted sex offenders can never be housed in minimum security.
It is the classic congressional reflex. An agency steps on a massive PR landmine, and lawmakers immediately pull out the legislative Sharpie to draw a permanent line.
Proving that sometimes high-profile VIP treatment is the absolute fastest way to unite lawmakers in writing new rules.
A beautiful, fleeting moment of bipartisan panic.
That's Floor Notes Extended for today.
Thanks for staying in the weeds with us. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll catch you next time.